Join me in a word of prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God. Amen. So we heard the beginning of the story of Ruth just now. The whole book is only 4 short chapters long. I was tempted to have the whole story read, but then I thought of Toma, and that seemed like a lot to ask. There was already so many names in just the beginning. So you all have a little bit of homework to do this week. Treat yourself and read the rest of Ruth. It's worth your time. It's an ancient short story. The names of the characters, when transliterated or translated literally, the husband and father was Elimelech, which means my God is king. And his wife Naomi translates to pleasing. But after the death of her sons Mahlon, which means sickness, and Chilion, which means wasting, she later in the story asks, when she returns home to Judah, asks to become Mara, which in her language means bitter. If we spoke ancient Hebrew, we'd get the intended meaning of the names much better. It's a tidy little story, written elegantly for its day, and it has a moral center. And that is the value of immigrants to a society that has turned too inward looking. Even though Ruth was set in the 11th century BCE, the time of the judges and the prophet Samuel, scholars think it was more likely written in the 3rd or 4th century BCE. That would have been in the Persian period, the time of the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah, after the Hebrews had been given permission to return from their exile in Babylon. As passages in Ezra and Nehemiah attest, the issue of intermarriage with people outside of their community at that time was a very controversial topic. Ruth is written, at least in part, to remind the Jewish people that a bloodline ancestor of David was a Moabite named Ruth. And no one in that time would argue with the legacy of David in Hebrew culture. The land of Moab was just on the other side of the Dead Sea, in modern-day Jordan. For a modern equivalent, that's like traveling from Indy to Dayton. And don't get me wrong, those Ohioans can be a handful, but to call them foreigners is a bit of a stretch. That is how small the world has become. Because in the ancient Holy Land, Dayton would have been an entire world away. On this day, we are holding the Ancestry Luncheon in the season of being rooted and blooming and bearing fruit. And in this time, I am reminded of another story of immigration, a story about an only son whose parents called him Charlie. Charlie wasn't his given name at birth. You see, Charlie's father, Kuan Yu, and his mother, Hui Wen, had come to Los Angeles in the late 1960s. When the U.S. had finally lifted the 1924 Exclusion Acts and they could secure visas, they left the island of Taiwan, disillusioned with the violence and intimidation they were experiencing from the nationalist takeover of the island, immediately following the Chinese Civil War that saw the communist takeover of mainland in 1949. It was a turbulent time for their homeland. Charlie's mother was only 2 months pregnant when they escaped Taiwan. Hui Wen had been a nurse and her husband Kuan Yu a research scientist. They had met at a health conference in Taipei, and from that day forward, never left one another's side ever again. They settled in Monterey Park, just outside of Los Angeles when they got to America and they began a new life. Charlie's dad entered a university program in bioengineering, mostly taking his classes at night while both he and his wife worked days at one of Los Angeles' many Chinese restaurants. When it came time for Hui Wen to give birth, they hailed a taxi cab to make their way to the hospital. Neither yet spoke much English, and so it took some gesturing to her big round belly before the cabbie realized where they needed to go. And once he did, the cabbie said, "Got it, folks. You're having a baby and need to go to the hospital, right?" And Kuan Yu managed, "Right." Off they sped through all the shortcuts and back roads that the cabbie knew. A few minutes into the cab ride, the cabbie turned on a local Taiwanese AM radio station, and the parents heard familiar voices coming through the speakers. It just so happened that Hui Wen's favorite song came over the radio, and she smiled. And then her husband smiled. And then the cabbie, glancing back at them about every 15 seconds to check on them and make sure nothing gross was happening in his cab, he smiled too. When they arrived at the hospital, Kuan Yu looked at the meter to see what he owed for the ride and noticed the meter had been turned off. When he pointed, the cabbie said, "No charge, best of luck." And Kuan Yu wanted to thank him, and so he looked down at the placard to find the cabbie's name. With one of the few English phrases that he knew, he said, "Thank you, Charlie. Bless you, bless you." His parents named the new baby boy Pai Han in respect for the elders and the culture from which they came. But at home, they only ever called him Charlie. Charlie was their American son, and they wanted him to be called by an American name. They wanted every advantage for him, beginning with a name that everyone in America could pronounce. The first few years of Charlie's life was tough on his parents. Between the restaurant work during the day and the classes at night, his father was barely home. And when Charlie was only 3 months old, his mother started leaving him with the aunties at the Taiwanese community center so she could put in some hours at the restaurant as well. They struggled through university and a master's program, years of student teaching, and finally, when Charlie was about 12 years old, his father earned a PhD and was offered a professorship at Cal State, Los Angeles. Charlie's mother never got to return to nursing. As she had done in Taiwan before they had come to America, all the family's resources going to her husband's education, as at that time it was more likely that he could be the one to succeed in academic endeavors than she would in America. So Charlie's mother continued working at the restaurant, only part-time while Charlie was very young, and as he got into school, she put in more and more hours there. She kind of liked the work. By the time Charlie was in middle school, his mom was managing the restaurant, and Charlie was there every day after school, clearing tables and washing dishes, watching the fire rise around the woks, smelling the bouquet of exotic spices that he never smelled at McDonald's, feeling the starchy steam escaping the rice pots, loving the sizzling sound of thinly sliced meats when they hit the hot pan. Charlie's parents had both spent hundreds of hours in the little off time they had learning English. It was something they were very committed to. And so by the time Charlie was in high school, they spoke English almost exclusively at home. That is, unless his parents were arguing. And that always happened in Taiwanese. Charlie's father had big plans for him. His American son would never be afraid for his life, never have to worry about government forces storming his home in the middle of the night. Charlie wouldn't have to do his university studies in a night program. He would never have to slave away sweating over a hot walk to make a living. All the worries and fear that had made up his own life would just be more ancestral stories for Charlie. Fears left in a distant past. And so when Charlie was just in high school, his father began bringing him to campus whenever he could. Charlie was never that interested in the people his father would introduce him to, students and teaching aides in his own engineering department, school administrators when he had the chance, professors in the fledgling computer science department. Even though computer science wasn't Kuan Yu's field, it fascinated him. And he could see the future of innovation in the sciences would be tied to the computer. So his father did all he could to see Charlie move towards computers for his education. Charlie was enrolled in a science-themed summer camp at the university, forced to be in math and computer clubs in his high school, and he was gifted his junior year a new home personal computer, which was a big purchase for the family. Although it was his dad messing around with it more than Charlie ever did, to be fair. When Charlie and his mother would return home in the evenings from the restaurant with stir-fried rice and dumplings, his father would always say, "Why do you still take Charlie with you to the restaurant?" And invariably those conversations, which began with a question in English, would end with arguing in their native language. Charlie's father thought his hours in the afternoon would be better spent with his studies, with time on the computer, with networking at the university. And Charlie's mother would always retort with, "I gave him a choice, and Charlie chose to help me at the restaurant." His parents didn't realize that Charlie had been learning Taiwanese for years. He was interested. His aunties from the community center in the early years spent time teaching him. The cooks at the restaurants helped him learn as well. He kept a secret diary of Taiwanese words in his room and would study the words by flashlight before bed, his parents assuming he was reading comic books. So by the time his parents' arguing got to the point where Taiwanese was spoken much more than English, he could understand what they were fighting about. "I didn't work and study 20 hours a day for over a decade so that our son could learn to become a fry cook." "Oh, so the work in the restaurant isn't dignified enough for you?" Charlie's mother would ask. "It's not that, but," his father would start to respond, "because please don't forget all I gave up for this family. I enjoyed nursing on the island. I was good at it too. I would have liked to go on to be a doctor one day, to go to night school like you got to do. But that is a choice that we made together." I know, his father would concede. "I appreciate all your sacrifices, Huai Wen. But are they worth it if Pai Han is allowed to be a cook for the rest of his life?" They only referred to Charlie as Pai Han when they were arguing in their native tongue. Back and forth, the arguments would go. Night in and night out, the same fight over him. Each worried for the future of their American boy. Each wanting their sacrifices to be worth it all. Charlie's father wanting achievement for his son. Charlie's mother wanting freedom for her son. Both remembering the limitations that were placed on their lives for coming here, both steadfastly resolute not to let that be Charlie's future too. When Charlie finished high school, he was accepted into the computer science program at his father's university. He knew the kinds of fights it would mean at home if he didn't accept. So he did. And in his first couple of years in his engineering courses, at least, he barely made passing grades. He did well in the humanities classes and enjoyed campus life. There were many 1.5 generation Taiwanese students like him on campus, and it made him feel comfortable. He found familiar community amongst them. Stories shared of the struggle and sacrifice of the parents were common to all his peers. Stories of English spoken at home, except for when it came to fighting. One day at the end of his sophomore year in college, Charlie saw a flyer for a summer cultural exchange program hosted by the Food Science Department. It was called Touring the Far East. Students would be immersed for a 6-week program in the food cultures of Tokyo and Seoul and Shanghai and Hong Kong and Taipei. Immediately, he knew he wanted to go. And immediately, he knew his father would not approve. So Charlie brought the flyer to his mother and confided in her his desire to go and learn. She took the flyer, went back to the restaurant office, and started making some calls. When she and Charlie returned home that evening, Charlie's mother announced that this summer, Charlie would go to stay for 6 weeks with her sister in Taipei. It was time that Charlie set his eyes on his people's homeland, she proclaimed, very matter of fact. She said it so matter of fact that Charlie's father didn't feel as if he could offer much of a protest, and so the plan was set. At the airport, Charlie's dad gave him a few computer programming textbooks, insisting he keep up on his studies while he was away. Senior year was coming, and cum laude graduation would help ensure a job from some of those new upstart programming companies in what they're calling Silicon Valley. Charlie took the books without question. His mother only gave him a kiss on the cheek and whispered to him, "Learn well." That tour changed the course of Charlie's life, and he never returned to the university after coming home. Charlie's father was bitterly disappointed and never forgave his wife for the deception, for allowing Charlie to go on a food science tour of the Far East, as ludicrous as that was. It was less than a year after Charlie's father had stopped speaking to him that his mother died. A brain aneurysm took her instantly as she sat at a back table in the restaurant folding napkins. Charlie's father blamed himself, and deep down he blamed Charlie too. At her funeral, Charlie's father didn't ask where Charlie was living, didn't ask what he'd been doing since leaving university, didn't ask about his life at all. Just thanked him for coming and asked that in honor of his mother, they not bring up anything that would lead to a fight. And Charlie agreed. Charlie didn't really want to tell his father that he had moved to San Francisco, that he had lived in hostels at first and made ends meet with a series of kitchen jobs. Charlie didn't want to share that he had gotten into the prestigious Culinary Institute of America and was on pace to graduate from his program top of his class. Charlie knew this wasn't the cum laude that his father had expected or wished for him, so he kept all that news to himself. It was 2 full years before Charlie's father would hear another word from his son. And as it happened, the day Charlie would finally call his father was the day the LA Times ran a feature on the cover of the entertainment section of the Sunday edition. A new, highly anticipated restaurant was opening downtown, and it was called the Huai Wen. Charlie's father couldn't believe the coincidence. A new restaurant featured in the paper by the name of his late wife. He was reading the article when the phone rang. "Hello? Hi, Dad." "Charlie?" His father's voice was excited and hopeful. "I go by Pai Han now. It's good to hear your voice, Dad. I'm sorry. I'm sorry it's been so long since His father interrupted him. Never mind that, son. Are you okay? Yes, Dad, I am. I have something to tell you. Son, you will never believe what I just read in the paper. A restaurant with your mother's name is opening here in Los Angeles. It's unbelievable. I know, Dad. It's mine. That's why I'm calling. I want you to... What did you say? It's yours? You are opening the Hawaii Wen? What do you mean it's yours? It's my restaurant, Dad, in honor of Mom. We are calling it Asian Fusion. We think it's going to be the next big thing. And I want you to be at the opening. I want you to be there. I think Mom would have really liked it, and I hope you can forgive me for disappointing you, and well, just be there for her. A long pause filled the space between them on the phone. And finally, just as Charlie was about to hang up, his father said, "It would be my deepest honor and pleasure to be there." I was the disappointment, Payan. I brought you and your mother to a land of freedom and opportunity and then proceeded to dictate to you both how you shall live your lives. I'm ashamed. And so I wouldn't miss in the opening of the Hawaii Wen for anything in the world. They wept together on the phone for some time longer, and then reminded one another of the stories that they each remembered of their wife and mother. And finally, they came around to smiling again. It's the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, as it is and was and will be. And for this gospel, good news of great joy. Thanks be to God.